All rise. The Honorable rw3dog is presiding over an ignition school at the Gravely Moen. Enjoy, guys. Thanks for watching. I got the recording box going. Can you say that again, Rich?
Is A.O. Smith the same as like the Smith?
A.O. Smith magneto.
Yeah, like the motor wheel.
Okay.
Early.
Very early.
That's not in the class what he's talking about.
It's not on the,
Okay.
not on the
It's
chart.
not in there.
Okay, hold on. Action.
Alright, so I gave everyone a handout. I want to talk about magnetos a little bit. And on Gravely's, probably the most common magneto is the Wyco magneto, which is like these guys here. And I'd say that probably 70% of Gravely's have a Wyco on there. As you get into older stuff, if you start from the 1930s, you have the Edison Splendorf magnetos. At some point they switched to Bendix and Fairbanks.
And Eisman.
My understanding is that Wyco bought out Edison and Splendorf at some point in time. And I think they basically just took the Edison and deep sixed it and took all the customers, if you will. You know what I mean? I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And I'm not clear on the exact year that happened, but I think it's around the 1950 mark, somewhere in there. And, you know, Wyco, you can still buy OEM parts for all the Wyco stuff today. I believe you can even buy a complete magneto still. Very expensive, but they exist, you know. So, the other, I wanted to talk about different Gravely's that have magnetos. So, obviously the L series have magnetos, which are these kind of magnetos, which are, you know, not part of the engine. So you could find a Wyco magneto, for example, on a John Deere tractor, John Deere A or B, they'd have these kind of mags, but they have 2 plug wires coming out of the cap instead of 1, but the rest of it's all the same, the points, the coil, everything. So Gravely used the shaft on the end of the camshaft to drive this magneto with a coupler in between it. And, you know, if you think about older engines, they didn't have the technology of, think of like a modern Briggs engine where there's a coil under the flywheel, and they didn't have any of that, so they just used an external device to make spark. There's old cars from the like 1900, 1920 in that range that also use magnetos to power those engines. Today, airplanes are use magnetos, so anything that's a gas engine airplane has a magneto ignition. And they actually have a fail-safe, and they have 2 magnetos. So if one of them craps out in the middle of the air, they can hit a switch and use the other one. Pretty neat, you know. If you guys are into car racing, sprint cars have magnetos. They don't have any battery or any electricity on there. They use a magneto. It's pretty neat. So that is the beauty of this, is that it requires no power for the magneto to work, which is kind of unique, you know. You think about Kohler engines that have a 12-volt coil, and they have to have a battery, you have to have a charging system, you have to have a lot of things that a Model L doesn't require, right? So the other engines that I want to talk about was Kohler, and Kohler uses this coil like this that goes under the flywheel. And then if you have the handout, on the bottom here I have a picture. So mainly the 8-horse Kohlers are where you're going to find the majority of this kind of coil. And the difference with Kohler is that there's a magnet on the flywheel that goes around, and when it goes by the coil it generates the spark. You can still buy these coils. You can buy like a knockoff one on Amazon. They're like $15. They're readily available, which is pretty neat. But I have a machine that's a commercial 8 Gravely, and it's a very early one. I think it's in 1968. They had what's called a rotor magneto, the early Kohlers. There's a small rotor, which is in one of these pictures here, the top one. It's hard to see because it didn't print very well, but there's basically a little magnet rotor that goes over the crankshaft, and then the coil has like a kind of like a C-shaped thing that goes around that, which is pretty neat. But those are old. Like if you go into the early 60s, Kohler used that, and then when they got to the late 60s, they turned into the type that this coil goes on. The old type are really hard to find those coils for. Other tractor brands like Wheel Horse use that type also, the old type. So there are guys that look for those things. Sometimes, I didn't see it here today, but sometimes you might have a Wisconsin VKN engine on a Gravely. And they have a magneto, but instead of having this coupler shaft, it has a gear on there that it's timed with. So it actually has a gear that connects into the engine. So with Gravely's, what I found over the years is that I find that the Wyco is the most reliable one, easiest one to work on, easiest one to get parts for also. I had one machine with a Bendix magneto. It just started running bad. I could tell that the coil was probably weak, you know. And sometimes when the coils get hot, they'll lose their spark and they'll have weird things start to happen, lack of power, whatever. But the Bendix mag, I junked that thing and put a Wyco on there. I unbolted the Bendix, I put the Wyco on there, I go to pull it to start, it almost ripped my arm out of my socket. So what's called timing was the problem. And if you look at these Wyco mags on the front here, most of you probably know this, but I'm going to talk about it anyways. There's a mark that's on the timing coupler, right? So that mark lines up with another mark up here. This one doesn't have a mark on it, Steve.
I don't know, I just grabbed them off my shelf, sorry.
Yeah, it's probably full of dirt or something, but there's a mark up here, and when you turn that magneto and those marks align is when the spark happens. So that Bendix mag was about 90 degrees out from where the Wyco mag was. So when I put that Bendix on there and I pulled it, it almost tore my arm off. The timing was totally screwed up. So in here I have some different things about timing and some actual from Gravely service manuals information that they show you about it. But what I found is that the easiest way, first thing I want to talk about is how to take the magneto off the tractor and then how to put it back on and have your timing be correct. So what I do is I look at those timing marks. I'll turn the flywheel in the back. I might go a whole revolution around so I can get to where they line up. You can hear what's called the impulse engage at that point. You'll hear the spark snap. You know? What I like to do is I then start turning it again, and the line right now is say like this. I start turning it around in the circle, and when it gets to almost straight up, maybe a little bit before, that's when I take my magneto off. And it's at a point where the impulse mechanism spring hasn't started to get tension on it yet. So after you service your magneto and you want to bolt it back on the tractor, I'll just turn this and say, okay, here it's going to spark right there. I'll back it off so it's a little before straight up, and I'll put it on in that same orientation. You got a 50-50 chance of it being wrong, right? It can either be right or it's off 180 degrees. If you put it on and it's off 180 degrees and you pull it, it's going to sound like it's backfiring through your carburetor most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't make that sound.
He's really good at that.
What's that?
He's really good at putting them on 180 out.
But anyways, that method has worked good for me, and I use it every time. I never have a problem. So what I want to talk about next was like servicing the magneto. So I brought this magneto here, which this tractor this came off of ran 3 weeks ago. Now, at my house it's rained almost every day for 3 weeks, right? So these things could be finicky, but let me just take these screws out here for a minute. So there's two sides to the magneto. There's the side where the cover is, which has your points, and there's the back side, which has your impulse mechanism. We'll start by talking about the point side here. So the first thing that's important to know about is the gasket around the cover plate. Oftentimes those gaskets break. This gasket is completely intact. Normally you wouldn't take it off, but it's completely intact. You can still buy these, they're only a couple bucks. But if this tractor got into weather, like say some of mine were, and this gasket's broken and it rains, that rain's going to come down inside there and make a problem. Not just rain, but moisture, right? You can see, maybe not from your seat, but around the bottom here, there's a lot of corrosion on these gaskets. So moisture is definitely getting in there. And when moisture gets in there, that screws up your points. If you run a Kohler engine and you have the points covered, there's a gasket around the base of the points cover. And there's also a little gasket that goes around where the wire goes in. And oftentimes, the one where the wire goes in seems to be broken or missing. And it's just like leaving your window open when it rains, right? You're going to just hope that rain doesn't come in, right? It's the same thing with moisture. So, in my handout here, I'll talk about the different reasons that I see when magnetos don't work. The first thing is usually dirty points. In my experience, probably almost 99% of the time, the problem is the points are dirty. And the points, you'll see right here, they'll open and close as the magneto turns, right? No different than points on Kohler if you're a Kohler guy. So there's different ways to clean the points. Sometimes you can visibly see it that they're really crusty. They might even get green junk on it, whatever. Other times you'll look at it with your eye and you'll say it doesn't even look dirty. But it doesn't really take much. If there's a little film of anything on there and they can't conduct between the two of them, you're never going to get any spark. So sometimes I'll use one of these little brass welding brushes and I'll just spread them apart, and sometimes you can get in there with that. Other times I might use some fine sandpaper, put that in between them and just work it back and forth. Some people will say after you do that, run cardboard through there. I just had a little piece of cardboard in my toolbox. This is a spark plug box. Other guys use a business card or something, but just run some cardboard through there and kind of clean it up. Some people will say never put sandpaper in there, grit will come off. I never had that be a problem, but that's a thing that people say. So, you know, I like to clean the points right with it on the machine, and I just kind of spread it apart and put it in there and work it back and forth. No reason to disassemble it. There's guys that claim that they can leave the magneto on the machine and take the cover off, clean the points while it's on the machine. Can anyone here do that?
Yeah.
You've done that?
On a pull start L.
Pull start, yeah.
Pull start L.
I've tried to do that. I
You gotta
can
get the right screwdriver. You need a right angle screwdriver or a little stub screwdriver.
Yeah. So I just take it off now.
Way easier to take it off.
Yeah, I'm like
It
a
is.
NASCAR pit stop now, taking the mag off. I'm pretty quick at it.
You got that little stubby wrench in your toolbox?
Yeah, somewhere in here. I have this wrench here that I like to use.
Yeah.
It's a Craftsman gear wrench.
See
This
that?
thing can go under the mag this way or this way. It can't turn very much, maybe only about this much, but I can get those two bolts out with this wrench. There's other guys that use these little stubby ones that are like this long.
I'm the stubby wrench guy.
The problem is if you buy a new one, they're kind of cheap, and this area around where the nut goes is too fat and it hits the casting.
Oh, I must got a good one then.
Yeah, here's something else I wanted to show you. So these mags, these are Steve's mags, these two.
Howdy.
These are newer mags. Now notice the bottom is flat. This mag here, that's mine, notice that little plus thing on there. So the older tractors, like the 1938 or whatever, the two bolts are 90 degrees different than the newer tractors. So this mag came off a 1961 Model L. It has this like adapter on there that changed at 90 degrees, which is kind of neat. A lot of people have never seen that before. The old mags that are like the Edisons, they actually have like a little peg that they go over on the tractor and maybe only one bolt. So they're a little different. So after the points, then the next thing down the line is the condenser. The condenser is basically a capacitor, and that's all it is. And what you got to realize is that these things here, like I'm talking about a 1961 tractor, right? Those things are, you know, 65 years old or whatever. You know, there's some magnetos that are from the 30s, they're 90 years old, you know what I mean? These things probably were never imagined that they'd be used so many years later. Even the last Model Ls that were built in 1976, those things are 50 years old now, right? So chances are they never expected these things to last that long. So you can buy condensers, they're fairly cheap, maybe under 20 bucks, right? But in 1950, when a lot of this stuff was developed, they didn't have the testing equipment that they have today. So my go-to tool is just my little, hold on. Someone's trying to buy something from me over there, but put that on hold. So there's tools, like Waco had a coil tester. There's actual tools that they made to test coils. You can use your multimeter on ohms and test a coil. And you know, Steve has these magnetos here, which maybe after the class we'll take apart. He got this from someone in coils written on there. So we're sitting here saying, well, what does that mean? Does that mean the coil's bad? Or does that mean the guy put a new coil in it? We don't really know. But what you can do is, there's two bolts up here that are screws that hold the coil in. Take those out and you can pop the whole coil. It slides right out the front. And you can put your meter on ohms and you can test the resistance in the coil. You can go from the little button where the spark plug wire would attach to the wire that comes out of the coil, and you can test that. Now here's the problem, is that none of the old literature tells you how many ohms it should be, right? And these Kohler ones in particular, there's a lot of guys that can't get spark on the 8-horse Kohlers. And I've tested new ones and old ones, and they seem to test around 8,000 ohms is where they seem to land. So how off can it be? I'm not 100% sure. If it's 7,000, it's probably okay. But if you test it and it's 2,000, it's probably shot. You know what I mean? We were working at the blow-in at Rich Nichols. Remember that? We were working on that magnet. I think it was one of the old Edisons. And he had a pile of parts. And he says, I want you guys to fix these magnetos. So we used the ohm meter and we tested the coil on the one we were working on. It had no ohms. It was toast. So we went to the next one, took out a coil that read about 8,000, put it in there. We had spark instantly. It was amazing. So you can test the coils, but usually you go points, condenser, and then there's the impulse. If you turn the tractor over and you don't hear that snap, then you want to take off the back here. I'm going to take this off on Steve's mag here.
Alright, I give you a 50-50 shot. I don't know if it works or not.
Yeah, so just one screw that holds the impulse on. And underneath
there goes the warranty now.
Gasket. You just gasket around it. There's a metal plate behind it. But if anyone wants to see it, there's a little trip arm that will come out under low RPM with just from centrifugal force. And it will hit this little stop over there. And then you hear that snap, the impulse. So sometimes you go to start a tractor and the impulse isn't coming out. So what I've found is that you can just put a little drop of oil in there. Maybe just needs a little lubrication. This thing, you know, is all full of crud in here. There's dirt, there's oil in here, there's all kinds of stuff in here. And it doesn't take much to lock it up. Other people I've seen have said online that sometimes it gets magnetized and it sticks to the metal and it won't come out. I've never seen that happen before. I don't know if anyone's seen that. You've seen that. I had one machine where the timing mark was 180 degrees off from where it's supposed to start. So somebody must have taken it apart at some point. Behind here there's a spring. It's like a wound up spring, almost like on a recoil starter type spring. So somebody must have had it apart, and when they put it back together, it was off a half a turn. So I just pulled it out, turned it half a turn, and pushed it back in, and my marks were good, you know? But, so that's the next thing. After the impulse, then you check your coil. And again, if you got an ohm meter, you can check that pretty good. Sometimes you run into a problem with the magneto shorting out to ground. So most mags will have a stop button on the side. And in here there's this post that has like a plastic, I I don't know what you want to call it, bushing or whatever, that goes through the metal case. Over time, sometimes that plastic might break or fall out of there, or crack, and vibration, whatever it is, but sometimes that gets screwed up and it's grounding itself out like you're holding down the stop switch the whole time. So you can use, if you got a volt meter, you can use your continuity tester function, hold it on this pin, and then hit ground, and if it beeps and it's making a circuit, then you got a problem that it's grounding out somewhere. You know? Sometimes there's wires that run across the bottom here that come over here. They may chafe and get a bare spot on them, so you got to inspect all that stuff. If you're running a newer Gravely, like that has the push button and the handlebar, sometimes the wire that goes up through the handlebar might be chafed, and that might be grounding it out, or the switch itself might be screwed up. If you're running a Kohler tractor with that pull start Kohler on there, sometimes the key switch might even be bad, or some of them have a push button stop, but those things can get screwed up and it could be grounding it out also. So that's the next thing to look at. What I always say is just unhook all this stuff. If you're not sure, just go to where all the wires connect on the points and unhook all the wires that go to the stop switch. If you got spark then you got a problem in your wiring somewhere else. So on the next page I'm going to talk about common magneto myths. And a lot of the stuff you read online, like there's guys that will say never turn the magneto over without a spark plug attached to it. I just did that, so I probably just ruined your mag, Steve. Sorry.
Oh, man.
But anyways, I've never had that do anything, right? I mean, if you turned it over 8,000 times, maybe it's going to do something, but just turning it over once or twice, I don't see where that's going to short out your coil, right? The next one is magnets. Now, Jamie asked me about magnets before. And there was a gentleman on Facebook for years that was saying that he'll recharge your magnets. And if you take this apart more, which I'm not going to do, but if you take off the rest of this impulse, you can pull the whole core of the magneto out of there. There's basically a round part with magnets on it. And a friend of mine said, you know what, I'm going to send one to get remagnetized to this guy that would always say this online. So how do you measure how strong a magnet is, right? Who knows, right? So what he did, you probably know, but I'll tell you how he did it in redneck fashion. He took nuts and he stuck them on there and saw how many nuts would hold on there, right? So he said, he told me he had 8 3/4-inch nuts on there or something like that. Maybe they're 1/2 inch, 3/4 wrench. So that's how he was measuring how strong it was. So he sent the magnet out. He didn't get his back, they just gave him another one because apparently this guy doesn't actually have a machine. He would send him to a guy with the machine. So he got a different one back. He stacked the nuts on there again, it had 8 nuts again. So nothing really changed. If you talk about the Kohler one that I was referring to with that rotor, I actually had one of those go bad. And you can hold something near it, like I held a wrench near it, and you can see how it sucks in there. And if you go to another one that's good, it really sucks in there, you know. But they do go bad on the Kohlers. I've never seen one go bad on here. The next one is that there's people that say there's no way to test a coil or a condenser. Like I was saying before, most voltmeters, like I have this Klein Tools one that I got at Home Depot for $40. I think it's fairly decent. But it can test a capacitor and it can do ohms. And when it tests a capacitor, I think it actually puts a little bit of power in there to test it. But again, there's no chart that tells you what the ranges should be, right? So sometimes if you bought a new condenser, you could test it and you could get an understanding what the reading is supposed to be, right? And then you can test your other ones and see if they're close to that. If they're not close to that, they're probably shot, you know? There's a guy on YouTube that I like called 805 Road King. Some of you have seen him. But he has a whole bunch of videos about working on Maytag engines, which have similar ignitions. And he actually takes the condenser. Here's one with a condenser. He cuts the end off with a little cutoff wheel on like a Dremel tool, and puts a new capacitor in there and fills it with epoxy. And you can buy a capacitor for like $1, right? So anyways, that's what he did. And I'm like, well, that's pretty cool. And he has a whole video about testing the capacitors and tells you what he feels the ranges should be in. If you work on that Kohler engine that I was talking about, the rope start ones, they have a different condenser than the electric ignition one. And the one that's on the battery ignition has a holder clamp just like these style do, like a band clamp around it. The one that's on the magneto ignition has like a little triangular flag off the side that's built into the case of that condenser, and it's different. Now, I have run a battery ignition condenser on the Kohler and it worked. You know, I don't know how sensitive it really is, but it has worked. Now I talked about the timing, and I'll go back to my example about that switching the Bendix mag to the Wyco mag, because that was a good example. And you know, so you can look in here and it'll tell you how the manual says to time the magneto. What I found is that right when that piston hits the top is when it should spark, right? And they'll tell you in different age Gravely manuals, they'll tell you different things. Like one says look at these marks on here, one says go 3/8 inch down. They'll have all these different things, but at the end of the day, if you just want to time it so that it sparks right when the piston gets to the top, it works 99.9% of the time. Now, what's interesting on here is that on this mag, you can see that there's one solid line, and then there's 2 dots, right? So what's neat about this Wyco magneto that maybe other magnetos don't have is that when it's turning at a low RPM and that impulse comes in, the timing is different than when it's running at high RPM and the impulse isn't engaged. So there's a thing called lag angle. And if you look at the Wyco service manual that's on the Gravely Tractor Club website, where's the one that I took off the cap on here? This part where the little nub is that the impulse mechanism hits, there's actually on the top, on the very top, there's a little timing mark, and it can be moved left and right to change how the timing is advanced. So when you start that engine, like I was saying, at the low RPM, and sparking at the top, the timing in the magneto is actually advanced to like 0 degrees, let's say, right? Most engines run at 20 degrees before top dead center, so it's really sparking before the piston gets to the top when it's in the operating range, let's say, right? So once this thing goes to a certain RPM and that impulse drops out, it actually changes the timing, and it goes to like the 20 degrees before top dead center, which is pretty interesting, you know? Now, the old Edison mags, they don't have that. They're just spinning, and that's it, you know? This guy here is a Fairbanks Morse mag, which it has an impulse, but I'm not sure if it has a timing change. You get what I'm saying? But yeah, these Fairbanks are very hard to work on if you've ever worked on one. One year at the low end, we tried taking one apart and switching around parts, and we ended up destroying the whole metal case. But I don't have much experience with them. So anyways, that's the lag angle. On the Kohler ignition, you have a flywheel. Think about like degrees. It's 360 degrees around a circle, right? And you have a magnet on that flywheel that's maybe this long. That's in one part of that flywheel. The way you adjust the timing on the Kohler ignition is through the point gap. So if you make your gap 20 thousandths like it says to do in the book, they perceive that that's the starting point on where the timing should be. Now, is it going to be right? Maybe not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But what I found has happened is that I'll give credit to a guy on Facebook, Greg Lofness, who some of you have seen on there. He's very knowledgeable about these ignitions. But what he said is that if your timing's off a little bit, because that magnet is so small, that when that flywheel comes around and it goes past that coil, it might be missing it. So if your points are opening when your magnet's over here and the coil's over here, it's never going to make a spark. It has to be in line with the coil when the point's open in order for it to make a spark. So these things don't have that kind of problem because it's all built into that, right? You can't screw that up. It's part of how it's built. But on that Kohler you can. And most 8 horses all have that ignition if they're full start. 32 rider, they had an under flywheel ignition just like the 8 horse. And most guys trash those things and just put a 12-volt coil on there and get away from it. But there's a lot to be said about the coil. Like I said at the beginning, it requires no power to run. So if you're like me and you have a lot of tractors but you don't have a lot of batteries that work, you can run the tractor with no battery in it. It won't matter, right? You can also put an electronic ignition chip on the Kohler that has the under flywheel ignition and get rid of your points. You can buy those chips online for less than $20. They're cheaper than points are, right? I actually have a Model L that I put a chip in and I deep six the points on that. And I started every year. It has gear reduction wheels and a rotary cultivator, and I use it 10 minutes a year to do my little garden that's 50 feet long. And ever since I put that in, I've never once had it not start on the second pull. And you know, guys will say, oh, you can't do that, it's going to destroy the coil. It's never destroyed the coil, but I'm running it 10 minutes a year. I would go out on a limb and say most of us aren't using our Model Ls 8 hours a day. They're getting used sporadically, you know. So what this guy Greg did is he took his continuity tester and he hooked it up to his points on the Kohler. If you ever work on a Kohler, there's a little hole there on the side of the blower housing, and when the flywheel gets to where the mark is, you're supposed to be able to see that through the hole to let you know that the timing is right? So on a battery ignition, you could use a timing light. You could shine it in there. On these things, what Greg did is he took that continuity tester and hooked it up to his points. So the minute they open, there's no continuity, the beep stops, right? So what he did is he turns that flywheel until that mark line's up, and he wants his points to be opening right as it's through there. And I thought that was pretty clever, you know. Then it doesn't matter if your points are 14 thousandths or 20 or 25, that's all irrelevant. You just need them to break when that thing gets to that mark. Let's see, what else did I have? That's pretty much all I had on my list. Now, we'll go into like a Briggs & Stratton somewhere here. I saw 816S, which has a Briggs & Stratton single cylinder. A Briggs coil like that, like those have, is also called the magneto ignition. And with those Briggs coils, they're pretty foolproof. What a lot of people don't know is that at some point the coils change. So I have a tractor that's a 8163B. In around 1982 to 1983, Briggs changed to an electronic ignition coil. They called it magnetron at the offset. So I actually have another one that's an 816S that's an older machine. And the flywheel, the way the magnets are polarized in the old ones are different than the new ones. They're like backwards. So Briggs, I don't know that they still do this, but about 10 years ago, I mailed my flywheel to Briggs, and they repolarized the magnet completely for free and shipped it back to me. And this great box that's all the styrofoam packed and everything, completely for free. But what someone told me is that if you had any defect in your flywheel, a hairline crack or something, they'd throw it out and you'd be up the creek, you know. But they did that for me, and then that allowed me to take the older Briggs, that's points ignition, and put the newer coil on it that's electronic and ditch your points. There's other guys that will buy the new coil. You can buy these coils cheap, 15 bucks, whatever, and they put them on upside down. And when you put it on upside down, it makes the polarity backwards, and it'll make it work on the old flywheel. Some Briggs had a 3-legged coil, which is a totally different animal. Steve knows about this. Than a 2-legged coil. You were working on what, Alice Chalmers or something?
Yep, 9 horsepower Briggs from the 60s.
Yeah. So a few years older than what we're working on.
Mm-hmm.
It has a completely different setup. I've worked on like an 8-horse Briggs on an old giant back leaf blower that's from 1968. That had a 3-legged coil.
Yep.
And the only way to overcome that was to put a newer flywheel on it that used a 2-legged coil. But the Briggs ignition is pretty foolproof. And newer Kohlers that might be the Magnum series also use a magneto ignition. The twin cylinder has 2 wires that come out of that coil. And the 1 cylinder just has 1 wire that comes out. There's some people that hate points so much that you can take a K-series Kohler, a Magnum, and change the bearing plate and the flywheel and convert it over to Magnum ignition. It's a lot of work, but it can be done. But in my opinion, that's the drawback. I have a lot of tractors, and a lot of them don't get used very often. Most of them are stored either in a tent garage or just outside. There's a lot of moisture involved. And the points seem to be the biggest, weakest link of all these old tractors, And you'll go to do a simple task that takes 10 minutes and you'll spend an hour cleaning your points and getting your tractor sparking, So a lot of people get frustrated with that. That's all I really wanted to share. Does anyone have any questions or any things they would like to talk about magneto related? If not, then thanks for coming. Oh, you got a question over here.
So you said the piston up.
Yep.
Alright, that's going to be about it for Ralph's Magneto School. I'm out of battery life. Bye, guys.
Exactly, yep. Hold the spark plug on the side of the case, like literally just like this. You're not going to get shocked, right? And you can hold it and you can take your, it's hard to do all this one-handed, but I can just hold it.